On January 31st, 1993, the wife and daughter of a Texas man named David Lewis would return home to discover him nowhere to be found. Soon after and across the country, an unidentified man would be spotted walking down the side of a highway before being killed in a hit and run. It would take over 11 years for these stories to converge. The disappearance, as you might expect, was sudden and abnormal, but shined light into the possibility that David Glenn Lewis just might have been hiding something.
Fans are going wild, and the show is about to begin. Welcome, everybody, to Bud Bowl 5.
Whoa, Ma, this place is rocking!
It was 1993. Super Bowl weekend, to be exact. With preparations in place in a lively Dallas, Texas, awaiting an influx of sports fans, festivities were abundant for one of the largest sports events of the year. On the 28th of January, David's wife and daughter, Karen and Lauren, embarked on a 400-mile trip from their home in Amarillo to Dallas for a weekend of shopping in the city. The reason why David stayed behind is unclear. Some have stated that he wanted to record the game to a VHS, and since their VCR lacked a function to begin a recording at a set date, he had to be there in person to start it. Others, like his wife, have made tangential statements alluding to the possibility that he had to work, since he was a lawyer. From the span of January 28th to the 31st, what took place back at the Lewis home is unclear. By January 31st, though, Karen's testimony aided investigators in piecing together those missing events. That evening, the game was scheduled to begin at 5:30 p.m. Central. A few hours after this, around 11:15 p.m., Karen and Lauren would arrive back at the home to discover David nowhere to be found. His car was missing. There was clean laundry in the dryer. His wedding ring and watch were intact on the counter. There were 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches in the fridge, and the VCR had recorded even after the match was over. At first glance, the circumstances here wouldn't exactly raise red flags, since there appeared to be no evidence of foul play. And so Karen assumed that he'd merely been working late or watching the game somewhere, and would return soon. David Glenn Lewis never returned home again. One day later, his wife would officially report him missing. At around 10:30 p.m. on the night of February 1st, a motorist on State Route 24 in Yakima, Washington, encountered what they believed to be a man walking on the side of the road. Since it was so late, his actions were cause for concern, since it wasn't exactly common to find people hitchhiking in the dead of night. While it was hard to tell, they believed that the man was dressed in military-style clothing and work boots. Following this odd encounter, they found a safe spot to make a U-turn so they could loop back around to check up on him. When they finally managed to get back, they discovered his body, but it was lifeless on the side of the road. A Chevy Camaro was also allegedly spotted fleeing the scene when they approached him. However, attempts at catching the plate information were unsuccessful. After this discovery, they rushed to file a report, and police arrived on the scene shortly after. Investigations into the body found that there were no drugs or alcohol in his system, and there was unfortunately no form of identification, leaving him stuck as an unidentified John Doe. The Camaro that was spotted was one of the only working leads, and since the shoulders on State Route 24 weren't exactly pronounced, the hit and run that took place was eventually deemed accidental, leaving the case to remain stagnant. Conversely, back in Amarillo, the investigation into David Lewis was just ramping up. The very next day, his red Ford SUV was spotted outside of the Potter County Courts building, a mere 10 miles from the local airport. Inside the glove box, investigators were able to find his credit cards, driver's license, and checkbook in spots that Karen claims he usually keeps them. Soon after this discovery, Karen Lewis expressed even greater concern since it was incredibly out of the ordinary for him to just up and vanish without any of his possessions or identification. It began to seem that there was a piece to the puzzle that investigators were missing. Something that had potentially placed David in the crosshairs of an adversary. In one of her testimonies, Karen claimed that a few weeks prior to his disappearance, her husband told her that he believed that he was in danger, but wouldn't provide any information as to what the immediate threat was. This eventually led David's family to express the belief that it could have been linked to his work as an attorney. He had allegedly been wrapped up in a high-stakes lawsuit against his former law firm, Ham, Irwin, Graham & Cox, with the wealthy client suing them for conflict of interest. A week after he went missing, David was scheduled to fly to Dallas for a deposition, determined to reveal the firm's misdeeds no matter the cost. It was noted by his father that shortly before he vanished, he claimed that he was, quote, going to tell the truth, whoever it hurts. These leads, unfortunately, also materialized nothing. A few months later, a discovery was made involving David Lewis and plane tickets that he'd purchased the weekend he went missing. Two of them. One from Dallas to Amarillo, Texas, purchased on January 31st, and a second from Los Angeles to Dallas, purchased on the 1st of February. This effectively places Lewis at the DFW airport on the 31st and at LAX the very next day. It's widely believed that he had pre-purchased his return flights while at each location, although the actual flight dates and if he used the tickets are unclear. This leaves us with three lingering questions though. Where was David Lewis going? How did he get to where he was without any sort of trail? And why did he purchase return tickets back home? To answer the second question, we have to consider the time period that his flights were purchased. Since it predates the 9/11 tragedy, airline rules in the US were much more lax than they are today. Back then, one could purchase a ticket using a completely different name since a valid ID wasn't required to board the flight. Of course, this is far from how things are today, so this doesn't work anymore, but most are set on the belief that this is what Lewis had done on his flights out of town. Regarding the why, well, that's still unclear. Some have postulated that he was trying to get away from that aforementioned threat, covering up his tracks along the way. It's believed that, for him, it wasn't as imperative to fly under the radar, so to speak, while returning home. But that is, if he ever planned to. By June of that year, leads remained sparse as circumstantial details trickled in. It seemed like piecing together what and where David Lewis did and went was paramount to harvesting any sort of answer on his current whereabouts and motivations. A Del Rio, Texas news publisher by the name of the Del Rio News Herald published an allocated timeline up to that point in the investigation, and while it doesn't exactly provide any definitives, it does exemplify the fact that Lewis's weekend was far from ordinary. According to the write-up, starting on Thursday, January 28th, Lewis had left his workplace at noon, claiming he was sick. The next day, a friend spotted him rushing through the Southwest Airlines terminal at the local airport with no luggage. On Saturday, $5,000 was deposited into Lewis's bank account, with the neighbor spotting his red SUV at home. By Sunday morning, he was spotted at the court building, taking a photo of his car in the parking lot. And by Monday morning, a Dallas cab driver drove a man matching the description of Lewis from a hotel to the Dallas airport. The driver claims that, quote, "The passenger seemed nervous and fumbled through a wad of $100 bills to pay the fare." Now, if we assume that all of these claims are accurate, then they hint at the possibility of Lewis paying for his plane tickets with cash to further avoid being tracked. Considering the fact that he left all of his personal possessions, including his credit card and ID at home, this, of course, makes sense. What stands out here, however, is the $5,000 that was placed into his account. Unless he was allocating a substantial chunk of that for some other obligation, I don't think a few taxi rides and plane trips would come anywhere close to reaching that monetary milestone. The only explanation that could account for a sum of this magnitude would be some sort of direct deposit from his employer being wired into his account. Considering the fact that he was a longtime lawyer, it wouldn't be far-fetched to assume that this would be the reason. But if that were the case, why would it, at all, be notable? If this were his typical pay, then it would be simple to discount it as just that: work compensation. Just food for thought. Jumping to his Dallas, Texas encounter on February 1st, I'd like to highlight something. If he were taking a taxi from a hotel to the Dallas airport, then we have to assume that he spent the night in Dallas after arriving there the previous day. Thinking back on the chain of events, though, presents a unique inconsistency. Looking back, we can recall that Lewis allegedly wanted to record the Super Bowl, and there were freshly made sandwiches in the fridge. If David were to have been spotted that morning taking a picture of his vehicle at the court building, then his only method of getting back home would have been taking a taxi or getting someone to pick him up. For someone with so many extraordinary variables surrounding his disappearance, something as simple as wanting to record a football game is immensely unexceptional. The typical long-play VHS tape records approximately 4 hours of footage, and the average football game is around 3 hours and 12 minutes long. If we're assuming that the VCR didn't have any sort of auto-record feature, then it makes the events surrounding this that much more puzzling. Why go through the effort of dropping your car off that morning only to make it back home, going about your day, and even making sandwiches like everything's alright? Why up and vanish after 5:30, leaving behind everything you have? This is, of course, assuming that the VCR did not have an auto-record function. Unfortunately, confirmation for and against this minute detail have never been released, and because of that, it's unclear whether he left that morning when he was spotted, or later that night. That sentiment largely encompassed the Lewis case investigators. It seemed that the pieces were falling in line, however substantial answers and leads to the body were mostly non-existent. Because of this, and after 11 months, the search unfortunately concluded, leaving this case to sit untouched until anything further came of it. It would take over 10 years before the events that took place in Yakima and Amarillo would converge. In 2004, a Washington state detective named Peter Ditter was reading a series by the name of Without a Trace. After becoming fascinated with the topic of missing persons, he embarked on a personal journey to identify any that he could. After looking into a few and their characteristics, he eventually stumbled upon coverage of the situation that played out that night in Washington. He cross-checked the photo from the crime scene with various contenders and realized that the person looked incredibly similar to David Glenn Lewis of Amarillo. The only catch was that Lewis was known to have worn glasses, while the unidentified body wasn't wearing any when he was found. Upon further investigation into the characteristics and items that were found on John Doe's body, however, a pair of glasses were among them, effectively sealing the deal that this man was, in fact, David Glenn Lewis. But of course, this discovery would only raise more questions than answers. What obligations would David Lewis have in Yakima, Washington, of all places? Why was he spotted in military-styled clothing and work boots, attire that Karens come forward to claim are extremely unusual for him? If he had all this cash, why couldn't he grab a rental car or a taxi? We can't claim that he had drugs or alcohol in his system since those tests came back negative. So why exactly was he spotted walking down the side of a Washington highway at 10:30 at night? Well, that's where everyone's stuck. Some have postulated that it could have been tied to the case he was working on against his former employer, and others have settled on the possibility that it could have been linked to a mental breakdown. If you ask me, I believe it was tied to sudden paranoia brought upon himself through that threat he alluded to with his wife. What that threat is could be tied to his work, or could be something completely out of the picture. Considering the fact that he ended up in Yakima, Washington of all places, lends to the potential that he might have been more secretive than he made out to be. But that's the thing. That's merely speculation. Something that this investigation is no stranger to. And that's where we sit. The inconsistencies and questions surrounding his disappearance are some that have gone unanswered for decades, leaving investigators scratching their heads. Unfortunately, it just might stay that way because the only person who truly knows what played out that bizarre weekend is David Glenn Lewis, who left his entire life behind with hardly a lead to follow.